My mother-in-law convinced my husband to put the house in her name for tax purposes. She smirked, knowing she could throw me out any time. She'd remind me I was just a guest in her home. The day she tried to evict me, I handed her a folder. Inside were documents that proved she'd made one very expensive mistake. "Lindsay, darling, you've hung the hand towels wrong again." I froze in the doorway of what I'd foolishly believed was my bathroom, watching Diane refolding the cream-colored towels I'd just arranged 5 minutes earlier. Her manicured fingers worked with the precision of a surgeon, each fold crisp and deliberate, while she spoke without looking at me. "The decorative edge faces out, not in. I've shown you this 3 times now." 3 times. She was counting. Of course she was counting. When I married Adam 2 years ago, I thought I was building a life with the man I'd fallen desperately in love with. The gentle soul who brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning and left little notes in my lunch bag. What I didn't realize was that I'd also inherited a mother-in-law with a God complex and 27 years of practice wielding it like a weapon. "Sorry, Diane. I'll remember next time." The words tasted like sawdust in my mouth, but I'd learned that resistance only made things worse. She turned then, her pale blue eyes scanning my face for signs of defiance. Finding none, she smiled, that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Of course you will, sweetheart. We all have so much to learn when we're young." I was 31. He said it like I was 12. Diane Matthews ran her household like a monarch who'd never been questioned, never been challenged, never been told no, by anyone who mattered. Everything had to be her way. From the specific Christmas china we used for holiday dinners to the exact route Adam took to work each morning to avoid unnecessary traffic. The morning Adam told me about the house transfer, I was standing in that same bathroom, brushing my teeth with the toothbrush she'd replaced because mine was the wrong brand for the holder. Through the mirror, I could see him in the bedroom, fidgeting with his tie, the blue one she'd bought him because it brings out your eyes better than that dreadful brown one. "Lindsay." His voice carried that particular tone I'd learned to dread, the one that meant he was about to deliver news that would change everything while pretending it changed nothing. I rinsed and turned, paste still foaming at the corner of my mouth. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom's accountant thinks it would be better for tax purposes if we put the house in her name. Just temporarily. It'll save us thousands." The toothbrush slipped from my fingers, clattering against the marble sink. "Put our house in your mother's name? It's just paperwork, Lindsay. A legal technicality." He was using his reasonable voice, the one he employed when he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "She's trying to help us." Help us. Right. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab him by those perfectly pressed lapels and shake him until he saw what was happening. What had been happening since the day we moved in with his mother temporarily, while we looked for our own place. That was 18 months ago. Dad, I smiled. Nodded. Watched my husband choose his mother over his wife. "If you think it's best," I heard myself say. The relief that flooded his face was almost comical. Almost. Diane never raised her voice, she didn't need to. She had perfected the art of the surgical comment, the kind that sliced clean through your confidence and left you wondering if you were bleeding or just imagining the pain. "Some women marry up," she'd say, usually while arranging flowers or folding laundry, her tone as casual as if she were commenting on the weather. "Others just hang on." Or my personal favorite, delivered with a theatrical sigh, "Adam's always been so generous with strays." Strays. Like I was some mangy cat he'd found in an alley instead of the woman he'd proposed to on bended knee in front of his entire family. The warning signs had been there from the beginning. I'd just been too love-drunk to read them properly. Our wedding gifts, for instance. Beautiful, thoughtful presents from friends and family that somehow kept migrating around the house like they were searching for their purpose. The crystal vase from my college roommate appeared first on the dining room table, then the hallway console, before finally settling on a bookshelf in the guest room. When I asked about it, Diane tilted her head with that practiced look of confusion. "Oh, sweetheart, it looks so much better there, don't you think? The light catches it beautifully." My grandmother's china, the set I'd treasured since I was 16, found itself relegated to the back of the highest cabinet, replaced by Diane's everyday dishes that cost more than my car payment. "We don't want to risk breaking something so precious," she'd said, patting my hand like I was a child who needed protection from sharp corners. Then there was the phone incident. I'd left my cell on the kitchen counter while I ran upstairs to grab a sweater. When I came back down, Diane was just hanging up, her expression serene. "Who was that?" I asked. "Oh, just someone asking for Lindsay Matthews." I told them there was no one here by that name. My maiden name. She told my own sister there was no Lindsay Matthews at this number. "Diane, that was probably my sister calling about." "Well, how was I supposed to know? You should really tell people to ask for Lindsay Porter if they want to reach you." Porter. Her name. The name I was supposed to have taken completely, erasing every trace of who I'd been before Adam. But it was her habit of planning Adam's schedule that really got under my skin. She'd coordinate his work meetings, arrange his dentist appointments, even RSVP to social events on his behalf, all without consulting me. Then she'd act genuinely surprised when I mentioned having other plans. "Oh dear, I already told the Hendersons we'd be at their anniversary party Saturday night. You don't mind, do you? Adam loves their parties." Did Adam love their parties? I honestly couldn't tell anymore what Adam loved versus what Diane had decided he should love. The morning after the house transfer conversation, I stood in the kitchen. Her kitchen, as I was beginning to understand, making coffee with hands that shook slightly. Adam had already left for work, kissing my forehead absently while Diane watched from the breakfast nook like a hawk observing mice. "More coffee, Mom?" he'd asked, not waiting for an answer before refilling her cup. She'd smiled at him with genuine warmth, the kind of smile I was beginning to realize she saved exclusively for him. "Thank you, darling. You're such a good son." The emphasis on son was subtle but unmistakable. A reminder that he was hers first, mine second. After he left, we sat in silence for exactly 4 minutes, I counted, before she spoke. "You know, Lindsay, I hope you understand how much Adam loves this house. It's been in our family for 3 generations. Our family. Not including me, apparently. His great-grandfather built the foundation with his own hands. His grandfather added the second story. His father and I renovated the kitchen." She gestured around the gleaming space with its granite countertops and custom cabinets. "Every Matthews man has raised his children here." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Adam would raise his children here too, but would I be the one raising them with him? "It's a beautiful house," I managed. "Yes." She sipped her coffee, studying me over the rim. "I'm sure you'll take very good care of it while you're here." "While I'm here?" "Not while we live here, or while you're part of the family. While I'm here. Temporary, conditional, subject to change without notice." That was the moment I realized I was truly alone in this marriage. Standing in what I'd thought was our kitchen. Her kitchen. While they discussed my future without consulting me, planned my life without including me, made decisions about my home without remembering that I lived there too. I excused myself and went upstairs to the bedroom Adam and I shared, closing the door carefully behind me. In the mirror above the dresser, I looked at the woman staring back, pale, tired, smaller somehow than she used to be. When had I become someone who smiled and nodded instead of speaking up? When had I started asking permission to exist in my own life? I didn't have answers yet. But looking at that woman in the mirror, I made a silent promise. I would find them. I just had no idea how much that promise would end up costing all of us. The answer to my silent promise came from the most unexpected source, and at the most unexpected time. It was 3 weeks after that bathroom confrontation, on a Thursday afternoon when the September sun painted everything golden. I was in Richard's garden, deadheading the roses he'd tended with religious devotion for the past 15 years. He'd been having what Diane called one of his good days, which meant he wasn't clutching his chest every time he stood up from his favorite armchair. I didn't expect him to join me outside. Richard Matthews was a man of quiet routines, and those routines had become even more rigid since his second heart attack 6 months earlier. Morning coffee at 7 sharp, afternoon medications at 2, evening news at 6. But there he was, walking slowly down the stone path, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea like he'd planned this moment. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, settling onto the wrought iron bench with the careful movements of someone whose body had started betraying him. "Thank you." I accepted the glass, noting how his hands shook slightly, not from age but from the cocktail of medications that kept his damaged heart beating. "The roses are beautiful this year. That's all you." He smiled, and for a moment I saw where Adam had gotten his gentle eyes. "I haven't been much help lately." We sat in comfortable silence, watching bees work their way through the late-blooming flowers. This was how Richard and I had always communicated best. Without pressure, without performance, just two people who understood that sometimes the quiet said more than words. Lindsay. His voice was different suddenly, more serious. I need to tell you something. I turned to face him fully, struck by the intensity in his expression. He was studying my face like he was memorizing it, cataloging every detail. You're your father's daughter, he said finally. And that's the highest compliment I can give. My breath caught. Richard rarely mentioned my father, though I'd known they'd been friends. What I hadn't understood was the depth of that connection, how it had shaped the man sitting beside me and apparently how he saw me. Your dad and I served together in Vietnam. Did you know that? I shook my head stunned. My father had never talked much about his military service, and I'd never thought to ask Richard about it. We were 19, scared out of our minds, convinced we were going to die in some jungle on the other side of the world. Richard's voice grew distant, traveling back decades. But we had each other's backs. Boys. When I got hit by shrapnel, he touched his left shoulder absently. Your father carried me 2 miles to the medics. Saved my life. The ice cubes in my tea clinked as my hands trembled slightly. Dad never told me. He wouldn't have. That's who he was. Richard turned the glass in his hands, condensation dripping onto his khaki pants. When we came home, we started that construction business together. Matthews and Harrison, remember the sign? I did remember vaguely. A faded wooden sign in my father's garage that I'd seen as a child but never really noticed. We were going to build half the town together. Got married within 6 months of each other. I married Diane, he married your mother. We were going to be business partners, neighbors, watch our kids grow up together. What happened? Richard's expression darkened. Diane happened. She didn't like sharing me with anyone, including my best friend and business partner. Started making comments about your father's work ethic, his ideas, his family. Small things at first, then bigger ones. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This pattern was achingly familiar. She convinced me that he was taking advantage of our friendship, that I was doing all the work while he got equal credit. I was young and stupid and... He paused, shame flickering across his features. I was already learning it was easier to agree with Diane than to fight her. The construction business dissolved. My father started his own company. Richard kept the original name. They stopped speaking, stopped seeing each other, stopped being the brothers they'd been in that jungle. 32 years, Richard whispered. 32 years I let her convince me that my best friend was my enemy. I reached over and covered his weathered hand with mine. Dad never seemed bitter about it. No, he wouldn't have been. That wasn't his way. Richard smiled sadly. When he was dying, cancer wasn't it? He called me. First time we'd spoken in decades. My chest tightened. I remembered those final weeks, how my father had made mysterious phone calls from his hospital bed, conversations he'd claimed were just tying up loose ends. He didn't blame me for what happened. Said he understood how hard it was to stand up to her. But then he asked me something that's haunted me ever since. What? He asked me to watch out for you. Said you had his stubbornness but also his sense of justice. Said you'd need both with this family. Richard's voice broke slightly. He knew Lindsay. Even after all those years, he knew exactly what Diane was capable of. The garden blurred as tears filled my eyes. My father had seen this coming, had known I'd need protection in ways I couldn't even imagine yet. I promised him I would, Richard continued. But I didn't know how or when or even if you'd need it. You seemed so happy when you and Adam got engaged. So sure of yourself. I was. The words felt hollow now. I thought I was marrying into a family, not a battlefield. Richard was quiet for a long moment, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder near the fence. When he spoke again, his voice was firmer, more resolved. She's going to try to push you out, you know. It's what she does. She can't stand competition for Adam's attention. And she certainly can't stand the thought of sharing control of this family. The house transfer is just the beginning. He turned to face me fully. Lindsay, I need you to listen carefully. I've been making some arrangements. Legal arrangements. Just in case. My heart began racing. What kind of arrangements? The kind your father would have made if he'd lived to see this. Richard reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a business card. Harold Brennan. He's been my attorney for 20 years and Diane doesn't know about half the work he does for me. I stared at the card, cream-colored, simple with just a name and phone number. I've been asking you about your career goals, your dreams because I needed to understand who you really are beyond what Diane sees. And what I see is exactly what your father predicted. Someone with backbone who just needs to remember she has it. The pieces began clicking together. The conversations we'd been having over the past few months, Richard's sudden interest in my thoughts about the future, the way he'd grown increasingly quiet during Diane's monologues at dinner. You've been planning something. I've been planning everything. His smile was grim but determined. Your father asked me to protect you and I failed him once already by letting Diane destroy our friendship. I won't fail him again. A breeze rustled through the roses, carrying the scent of autumn and change. Richard stood slowly, using the bench arm for support. Harold's expecting your call. Not today, not tomorrow, but when the time comes and you'll know when that is. Call him. Tell him Richard sent you and tell him it's time to open the package. What package? But Richard was already walking back toward the house, moving with more purpose than I'd seen from him in months. Richard, wait. He paused at the garden gate, looking back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the gentle, defeated man who'd learned to bend to his wife's will, but someone harder, more resolute. She thinks she's won, Lindsay. She thinks she's finally gotten everything she wanted. The house, Adam's complete loyalty, and you under her thumb. His smile was sharp as broken glass. She has no idea what's coming. That night, I lay awake staring at the business card I'd hidden in my jewelry box. Harold Brennan. A name I'd never heard before, representing possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. What I didn't know then was that Richard Matthews had been planning his final act of rebellion for months. A rebellion 32 years in the making, designed to honor a friendship Diane had destroyed and protect a daughter-in-law she was determined to break. I thought it was a kind goodbye from a man who'd always treated me like the daughter he never had. I had no idea it was the beginning of my safety net, or that the gentle, quiet man everyone underestimated was about to prove he'd been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. Richard's funeral was held on a Tuesday in October, under gray skies that seemed fitting for the somber occasion. The service was small, dignified, exactly what he would have wanted. I stood between Adam and Diane at the graveside, watching them lower the man who'd become my unexpected ally into the ground, and felt a profound loneliness settle over me like a shroud. Diane played the grieving widow perfectly. Black dress, modest heels, tissues dabbed delicately at her eyes at precisely the right moments. She accepted condolences with gracious nods and spoke in hushed tones about Richard's peaceful passing, and how blessed they'd been to have so many years together. I said nothing about our conversation in the garden. The business card Harold Brennan had given me remained hidden in my jewelry box, waiting. It didn't take long after the funeral for Diane to show her full hand. 6 weeks to be exact. Just long enough for the sympathy casseroles to stop arriving and the concerned phone calls from relatives to taper off. The transformation was subtle at first. She began referring to my house instead of our house in casual conversation. When her sister called to check on how she was adjusting to widowhood, I overheard Diane say, "Oh, I'm managing fine in my own space. It's actually quite liberating." My own space. Like I wasn't sitting 10 feet away, folding laundry in what she now considered her living room. Then came the bridge club. Diane had always hosted her Tuesday afternoon bridge games, but after Richard's death, they took on a different tone. Where once she'd introduced me as Adam's wife, Lindsay, I became Adam's wife who stays at home, never by name, always by function, always with a slight emphasis that made it sound temporary. "Oh, this is Adam's wife," she'd say when Mrs. Henderson or Mrs. Chin asked about me. "She keeps herself busy around the house. Keeps herself busy." Like I was a pet with hobbies rather than a grown woman with a college degree and a career I'd put on hold to help care for Richard during his illness. The morning everything changed started like any other. Adam was rushing around the bedroom, packing for what Diane had termed an important business conference in Denver. I'd watched her plant the idea weeks earlier during one of their morning coffee chats. "You know, darling, that Morrison account would really benefit from some face-to-face attention. Didn't you say they were having their quarterly meeting next month?" Adam had looked surprised. "I hadn't really thought about attending in person. It's a week-long conference." "Oh, but think of the impression it would make. Your dedication, your commitment to client relationships." She'd reached across to pat his hand. I think it's exactly what your career needs right now. By the end of that conversation, Adam was convinced the Denver trip had been his idea. Now, watching him fold shirts with the distracted efficiency of someone whose mind was already elsewhere, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. You sure you'll be okay here with Mom? He asked, not really looking at me as he zipped up his garment bag. We'll be fine, I said, though something in my chest was screaming that we absolutely would not be fine. He kissed my forehead, a habit that had once felt loving but now seemed perfunctory, and headed downstairs. I heard him exchange goodbye pleasantries with Diane, heard the front door close, heard his car pull out of the driveway. The house fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I stayed upstairs for as long as I could, reorganizing my closet, cleaning the bathroom, anything to avoid going downstairs and facing whatever Diane had planned. But eventually the need for coffee drove me to the kitchen. He was waiting for me. Not obviously waiting. Diane was too clever for that. She was sitting at the breakfast table with her own cup of coffee and the morning newspaper spread out before her, the picture of casual normalcy. But there was something in her posture, something in the way she looked up when I entered, that told me this moment had been choreographed. Good morning, Lindsay. Sleep well. Fine, thank you. I moved to the coffee maker, hyper-aware of her eyes tracking my movements. I'm glad Adam made it off on time. That Morrison account is so important to his future. I poured coffee into my mug, the plain white one she'd relegated me to after deciding my favorite ceramic cup didn't match the kitchen aesthetic. Yes, I'm sure he'll do well. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken tension. I could feel something building, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. When I finally turned around, Diane was watching me with that practiced smile, the one that never reached her eyes. Why don't you sit down, dear? There's something we need to discuss. The coffee turned to ash in my mouth. I sat across from her at the table where I'd eaten hundreds of meals, trying to read the expression on her face. She folded the newspaper with deliberate precision, creating a neat rectangle beside her coffee cup. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Richard passed, she began, her voice conversational, almost friendly. About the future, about what I want my life to look like going forward. My hands wrapped around the coffee mug, absorbing its warmth. I've realized that I'm ready to reclaim my independence. This house has always been my sanctuary, and I think it's time I enjoyed it on my own terms again. He paused, waiting for me to respond. When I didn't, that smile grew wider, more confident. I need you out by the weekend. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though some part of me had been expecting them for weeks. The coffee mug trembled slightly in my grip. Excuse me. I've already contacted a moving company. They're very professional. They'll be here Saturday morning to help you pack your things. She delivered this information like she was discussing the weather, casual and matter-of-fact. I thought that would be easier for everyone involved. My mind reeled. Diane, you can't just. Of course I can, sweetheart. The endearment dripped with false sweetness. It's my house now, remember? Richard left it to me, and with the transfer Adam signed, I have complete control over who lives here. She leaned back in her chair, and there it was, that smug grin I'd learned to dread. The expression she wore when she was about to deliver what she considered a killing blow. I'm sure you understand. A widow needs her privacy, her space to grieve properly. Having you here, well. She gestured vaguely as if my presence was somehow offensive. It's just not appropriate anymore. Where exactly do you expect me to go? I'm sure a resourceful girl like you will figure something out. Perhaps your sister in Colorado? Or maybe it's time to reconnect with your mother's family back east. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. She'd thought this through, planned every detail. The timing, when Adam was 3 states away and unreachable during his conference sessions. The movers, already booked before she'd even told me. The suggestions about where I might go, anywhere but here, anywhere that would make it difficult for Adam to find me when he returned. I should call Adam, I said, reaching for my phone. Oh, I wouldn't want to interrupt his important meetings, Diane said smoothly. You know how focused he gets during these conferences. Besides, this is really between you and me, isn't it? Between you and me. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than Adam's wife. I'm sure when you explain it to him, he'll understand completely. After all, you wouldn't want to force yourself on a grieving widow, would you? Her voice carried just the right note of wounded dignity. That would be rather selfish. I stared at her across the table, this woman who'd orchestrated my isolation with the precision of a chess master. Every move had been calculated, from convincing Adam to put the house in her name to arranging his convenient absence, from establishing legal control to positioning herself as the sympathetic victim. But as I sat there absorbing the full scope of her manipulation, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing defeat she was clearly expecting, I felt something else entirely. Clarity. Cold, sharp, crystalline clarity. My hands stopped shaking. My voice steadied. 27 years of her training had taught me not to give her the satisfaction of a visible reaction, but this was different. This wasn't surrender. This was the moment Richard had been preparing me for. If that's what you want, I heard myself say, surprising us both with how calm I sounded. Diane blinked, clearly taken aback by my composure. She'd been expecting tears, pleas, maybe even anger she could use against me later. Instead, I was giving her nothing. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this," she said, though something in her expression suggested she found my reasonableness more unsettling than satisfying. "Can I ask for one thing?" "Of course, dear. I'd like to gather my personal belongings peacefully. No interference, no commentary. Just let me pack what's mine." She nodded, perhaps relieved that I wasn't going to make a scene. "Naturally. I'm not unreasonable, Lindsay. I just think this arrangement will be better for everyone." I stood up from the table, leaving my coffee unfinished. "I'll start this afternoon." As I walked toward the stairs, I heard her say almost to herself, "I'm finally getting my house back." My house. Not our house, not the family home, her house. What Diane didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that I was about to make one phone call that would change everything. Harold Brennan was expecting to hear from me. And Richard Matthews was about to have the last word after all. I walked upstairs with measured steps, my hand trailing along the mahogany banister Richard had restored himself 20 years ago. Each step felt deliberate, purposeful, like I was climbing toward something instead of away from it. The bedroom Adam and I shared had never really felt like mine. Even after 2 years of marriage, it still carried the ghost of his childhood, high school trophies on the dresser, a framed photo of him and Diane at his college graduation prominently displayed on the nightstand. My belongings had always seemed like visitors in this space, tolerated but not truly welcome. I opened the walk-in closet and pushed past the winter coats Diane had insisted I store in the back because darker colors create visual clutter. Behind them, exactly where I'd hidden it 3 days after Richard's death, was the small fireproof box I'd purchased with cash from the hardware store downtown. The combination was my father's birthday, something Richard had suggested with a knowing smile when he'd given me the folder. "Your dad would appreciate the symbolism," he'd said. Inside the box, beneath my passport and birth certificate, lay the simple black folder that had been waiting for this exact moment. I remembered the afternoon Richard had pressed it into my hands, just 3 days before his final heart attack. He'd looked frilier than usual, his skin gray with exhaustion, but his eyes had been sharp and determined. "Only if she tries to hurt you, Lindsay. Only then," he'd whispered, glancing toward the house where Diane was preparing his afternoon medications. "Promise me you'll wait for the right moment." I'd promised, not fully understanding what I was agreeing to protect. Now, holding the folder in my hands, I felt the weight of his final gift. Not just the documents inside, but the trust he'd placed in me to use them wisely. I walked back downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet of the house. Diane was still in the kitchen, probably savoring her victory, already mentally rearranging the furniture to erase any trace of my presence. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway, folder in hand. For just a moment, something flickered across her face, curiosity, maybe even concern, but it was quickly replaced by her practiced composure. "Decided to be dramatic about this, have we?" she said, though her voice carried less confidence than her words suggested. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the granite island she'd spent thousands renovating 2 years ago, the same island where she'd served me my final ultimatum. I set the folder down gently, my fingers lingering on its edge. "You should probably look this over before you toss me out," I said, my voice steady as glass. Diane's perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together. "What kind of game are you playing, Lindsay?" "No game." I stepped back, crossing my arms. "Just some light reading." She stared at the folder like it might contain something dangerous. Which I supposed it did. I don't have time for whatever theatrical nonsense this is supposed to be. Make time. Something in my tone must have gotten through to her because she reached for the folder with the tentative movements of someone approaching a sleeping snake. Her manicured fingers, always perfectly maintained even in widowhood, hesitated at the edge. Richard asked me to give this to you, I lied smoothly. Consider it his final gift. That got her attention. Diane had always been sensitive about Richard's final wishes, perhaps because she suspected he'd seen through her more clearly than he'd ever let on. She opened the folder with the careful precision she applied to everything in her life. The first document was a legal agreement, typed on cream-colored letterhead from Harold Brennan's law office. I watched her eyes scan the opening paragraph, then freeze. Her lips moved slightly as she read, as if she couldn't quite believe the words in front of her. This is... She started, then stopped. Started again. This can't be legal. Trust agreement executed 2 months before Richard's death, I said conversationally. Giving me 44% ownership of all real estate and business holdings, including this house, the rental properties on Elm Street, and that little commercial building downtown where the florist and the insurance office rent space. Her hands were shaking now just slightly. She flipped to the next page, searching for some loophole, some technicality that would make this go away. Instead, she found Richard's letter. I couldn't see the words from where I stood, but I knew them by heart. Richard had read them to me that final afternoon, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. Diane has forgotten that family means all of us, not just the ones who share her blood. Lindsay has shown more grace and kindness in 2 years than some people manage in a lifetime. If you're reading this, it means she needs protection and I failed to provide it while I was alive. This is my attempt to right that wrong. Diane's face went through a fascinating transformation as she read. Confusion first, her head tilting slightly to the side like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then disbelief, her eyes widening as the implications sank in. Then something darker, more dangerous. He couldn't have done this without my knowledge, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Apparently he could. Apparently he did. She flipped to the third document, the email thread where she'd pressured Adam into the house transfer. I'd wondered how Richard had gotten access to those communications until I remembered that he'd helped Adam set up his email account years ago and probably still had the password. Her face flushed as she read her own words back to herself. I need insurance against her in case things don't work out. The house is the perfect leverage. This is private correspondence, she said weakly. Private correspondence that proves you coerced Adam into signing over the house specifically to use against me. I stepped closer to the island, close enough to see the slight tremor in her hands. That's called fraud, Diane. Or at the very least, undue influence. She was flipping through pages now with increasing desperation, looking for something, anything that would restore her advantage. Instead, she found the transcript of her phone conversation with her sister Margaret, the one Richard had recorded from the extension in his study. I'm finally going to get rid of that little gold digger. Once Adam's in Denver, I'll give her the boot. She can crawl back to whatever trailer park she came from. The color drained from Diane's face as she read her own words. She looked up at me with something approaching fear. How did you get this? Richard was more observant than you gave him credit for. I leaned against the counter, feeling strangely calm. Turns out he'd been documenting your behavior for months. The recordings, the emails, even photos of you going through my personal belongings when you thought no one was watching. That last part was a bluff. There were no photos, but Diane's guilty flinch told me I'd hit close to home. You can't prove any of this holds up in court, she said, but she was grasping now. Maybe not all of it. But the trust agreement? That's ironclad. Richard made sure of that. I pulled out my phone and showed her Harold Brennan's contact information. I called his attorney this morning. Fascinating conversation. Diane stared at the phone screen like it was showing her own death warrant. Turns out Richard had been planning this for a while. Ever since you convinced Adam to put the house in your name, actually. He knew exactly what you were trying to do and he made sure you couldn't do it. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the folder clutched in her hands like a life preserver that had turned out to be an anchor. This ruins everything, she whispered. No, I corrected gently. This ruins your plan to destroy me. There's a difference. For the first time since I'd known her, Diane Matthews looked genuinely defeated. The mask of composed superiority had slipped completely, revealing something smaller and more frightened underneath. "What do you want?" she asked. It was a fair question. What did I want? Revenge would have been satisfying, but as I looked at this woman who'd tried so hard to erase me, I realized I wanted something much simpler. "I want you to understand that you don't get to decide who belongs in this family," I said. Richard already made that decision. And apparently he chose me. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of that grandfather clock and the soft rustle of papers as Diane's hands continued to shake. Outside, storm clouds were gathering and I could smell rain in the air. The reckoning Richard had promised was finally here. The storm clouds that had been gathering finally broke open, sending sheets of rain against the kitchen windows. Thunder rolled across the sky like an ominous soundtrack to Diane's unraveling composure. She stared at the folder for another long moment before reaching for her phone with trembling fingers. The device slipped twice before she managed to unlock it, her usually precise movements clumsy with shock. "I need to speak with James immediately," she said when someone answered. Her voice cracked on the word immediately, the first time I'd ever heard Diane Matthews sound anything less than completely in control. I walked to the tea kettle more for something to do than because I wanted tea. The familiar ritual of filling it with water, setting it on the burner, gave me time to process what was happening. 27 years of Diane's psychological warfare, and she'd just been checkmated by her own husband. "James, it's Diane Matthews. I need you to look at something immediately. No, it can't wait until Monday. Because my dead husband apparently executed a trust agreement that gives my daughter-in-law 44% of everything I own." Her voice rose with each word, the careful modulation she'd perfected over decades finally cracking. I could hear a man's voice on the other end, calm and professional, asking questions she clearly didn't want to answer. "I don't know when he did it. I don't know how he did it. That's what I'm paying you to figure out." The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the tension. I turned off the burner and prepared 2 cups of tea, Earl Grey for me, chamomile for her. Muscle memory even in crisis. Even in the middle of a war, some courtesies persisted. I set the chamomile in front of Diane just as she was saying, "Fine. Bring the documents. Bring everything. I'll be here." She ended the call and stared at her phone like it had personally betrayed her. "Your attorney's coming over?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her. "James Whitfield. He's been handling our legal affairs for 15 years. She picked up the teacup with both hands to stop the trembling. "He helped me with the house transfer. He should have known about this. This conspiracy." Conspiracy. Interesting word choice. "Maybe Richard used a different attorney for the trust," I suggested mildly. "Richard didn't use attorneys without telling me. We discussed everything." But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. "We always discussed everything." The first crack in her certainty. I filed it away. We sat in uncomfortable silence for the next hour, rain drumming against the windows while Diane alternated between staring at the documents and glaring at me like I'd personally orchestrated Richard's rebellion from beyond the grave. When the doorbell rang, she practically leaped from her chair. James Whitfield looked exactly like central casting would order for expensive attorney. Silver hair, expensive suit, briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was also, I noticed immediately, deeply uncomfortable. "Diane." He kissed her cheek with the practiced familiarity of long association. His eyes found mine across the room. "Mrs. Matthews." "This is Lindsay," Diane said curtly. "The one Richard apparently decided to enrich at my expense." "Yes." Whitfield's discomfort deepened. "I've had a chance to review the documents you described over the phone. And..." He set his briefcase on the kitchen island, popped it open with sharp clicks. "I'm afraid they're legitimate." The word, legitimate, hit Diane like a physical blow. She actually swayed on her feet. "That's impossible. Richard couldn't have executed a trust of this magnitude without my knowledge. We shared everything." "Apparently not everything." Whitfield pulled out a thick folder of his own. "I did some investigating after your call. Richard retained Harold Brennan approximately 6 months ago for what Brennan described as estate planning matters. 6 months ago. Right around the time Adam and I had signed the house transfer papers." "Brennan." Diane's voice was hollow. "I've never heard of him." He's quite reputable. Specializes in complex estate structures and... Whitfield paused delicately. Family protection strategies. Family protection strategies. I almost smiled at the euphemism. The trust is ironclad, Diane. Richard clearly had competent counsel and everything was executed properly. Witnesses, notarization, proper filing, it's all there. But surely there's something we can do. A challenge based on diminished capacity or undue influence or... I wouldn't recommend that path. Whitfield's tone turned grave. The trust contains a no-contest clause. Anyone who challenges it forfeits their entire share. Richard was thorough. Diane sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her like air from a punctured balloon. What does this mean practically speaking? She asked. Whitfield consulted his notes. It means Mrs. Matthews, Lindsay, owns 44% of all real estate and business assets that were part of Richard's estate. The house, the rental properties on Elm Street, the commercial building downtown. And if I want her out of my house? It's not just your house anymore. He glanced apologetically at me. She has rights as a co-owner. If you can't reach an agreement. Partition sale, I said quietly. Both of them looked at me. I could file for a partition sale. Force the sale of the properties and split the proceeds according to ownership percentages. Whitfield nodded slowly. That would be within your rights. Diane's face went ashen. You'd force me to sell my home? I'd prefer not to. But if you insist on trying to evict me... I shrugged. I have options now. The irony was perfect. By putting the house in her name to gain control over me, Diane had created the very mechanism Richard needed to protect me. The transfer that was supposed to make me powerless had become the foundation of my power. How much would it cost to buy her out? Diane asked. Whitfield consulted his phone, probably checking recent property values. Given current market rates, probably close to $800,000. Cash. $800,000. I watched Diane's face as the number sank in. I don't have that kind of liquidity, she whispered. You could mortgage the properties, Whitfield suggested. Or liquidate some of your other investments. The tax consequences alone would be ruinous. Diane's financial acumen was finally working against her. And the properties have appreciated so much since Richard bought them. The capital gains would eat me alive. She was trapped. Richard had constructed an elegant financial prison, using her own greed as the bars. The tax advantages she'd been so eager to exploit had become tax burdens she couldn't escape. Her insistence on controlling everything had made her vulnerable to losing everything. There is one other option, Whitfield said carefully. What? Negotiate. Mrs. Matthews owns 44%, but she doesn't have to exercise her rights immediately. Perhaps some kind of accommodation could be reached. Diane looked at me across the table, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something approaching respect in her eyes. Or maybe it was just fear. What do you want? She asked. It was the same question she'd asked an hour ago, but the context had completely changed. Then she'd been trying to minimize damage. Now she was negotiating from a position of weakness. I want to stay in my home, I said simply. I want to be treated like a member of this family instead of an unwelcome guest. And I want you to stop trying to manipulate my husband against me. And if I agree to those terms, then I won't file for partition sale. We can work out some kind of arrangement that lets you keep living here too. The rain had stopped while we were talking. Afternoon sunlight was starting to break through the clouds, casting everything in a golden glow that seemed almost prophetic. Diane stared out the window for a long moment, watching water drip from the eaves of the house her great-grandfather had built. Richard knew exactly what he was doing, didn't he? She said finally. Yes, I said. I think he did. She turned back to me and I saw a woman who just realized she'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing a completely different game. He was always smarter than I gave him credit for, she admitted quietly. For the first time in our relationship, Diane Matthews had just told me the truth about something that mattered. It felt like the beginning of a very different kind of conversation. That beginning of a different conversation never quite materialized the way I'd hoped. Over the following weeks, Diane and I existed in a strange kind of détente. She stopped making snide comments about my presence in her house, but she also stopped making any comments to me at all. We moved around each other like polite strangers sharing a hotel lobby, cordial but distant, each acutely aware of the shifted power dynamic but unsure how to navigate it. James Whitfield drew up a temporary agreement that allowed us both to remain in the house while we figured out a more permanent arrangement. I kept to the upstairs, she claimed the main floor as her domain. We shared the kitchen in shifts, she took mornings, I took evenings. It was civilized and completely unsustainable. Adam returned from Denver 3 days after our confrontation, rolling his suitcase through the front door with the easy confidence of a man who expected his world to be exactly as he'd left it. I was in the living room when he walked in, reading a book I couldn't have described if someone had asked me, and I watched his face as he took in the subtle changes. Diane wasn't waiting to greet him at the door. The house felt different somehow, quieter, more cautious. And I was sitting in the chair that had always been unspoken claimed as hers. "How was the trip?" I asked, closing the book on my finger. "Good. Productive." He set down his suitcase and looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time. "Where's Mom?" "In her study." He waited for me to elaborate. When I didn't, he sat on the edge of the couch, suddenly looking uncertain. "Is everything okay? You seem different." "Different? I supposed I was." "We need to talk," I said. I told him everything. Not the version I might have told a week earlier, careful and diplomatic, cushioned with concern for his feelings, but the truth. All of it. The years of manipulation, the calculated cruelty, the house transfer that had been designed to control me, and finally Richard's extraordinary posthumous protection. Adam listened in silence, his face cycling through disbelief, denial, and finally a kind of sick recognition. He'd known on some level. He'd always known. "I can't believe she actually tried to evict you," he said when I finished. "Can't you?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I always told myself she was just particular, set in her ways. I thought if I could just keep the peace between you two." "You were trying to keep her happy at my expense." "Yes." The admission came out barely above a whisper. "I was." We talked for hours that night, the kind of conversation we should have had years earlier. Adam cried, actually cried, when I showed him the recorded transcript of his mother calling me a gold digger. He'd never heard her speak about me that way, never seen the woman she became when he wasn't watching. But knowing the truth and knowing how to live with it were different things entirely. The next few weeks were awkward and strained. Adam tried to play peacemaker, suggesting family dinners and movie nights like we could somehow pretend our way back to normal. Diane participated with the enthusiasm of someone attending a funeral. I went along with it because I didn't know what else to do. It was during one of these painful attempts at family harmony that I found the photo. I was looking for a spare phone charger in Richard's old study, a room Diane had avoided since his death, when I pulled open the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. Inside were the usual detritus of a man's life. Old business cards, reading glasses with scratched lenses, a small stack of photographs held together with a rubber band. Most of the photos were what you'd expect. Family gatherings, holiday celebrations, Adam's graduation from college. But near the bottom of the stack was one I'd never seen before. It was from my wedding day, but not one of the formal shots the photographer had taken. This was candid, unposed. Richard and me standing together during the reception, both of us laughing at something just out of frame. His arm was around my shoulders in a gesture that was purely paternal, protective. We looked like what we'd become, a father and the daughter he'd chosen. I turned the photo over and found Richard's careful handwriting on the back, in the blue ink he'd always preferred. Asterisk, she earned the Matthews name, Diane. You never did. Asterisk. I stared at those words for a long time, sitting in his leather chair that still smelled faintly of his cologne. This wasn't a message he'd written for me to find. This was a message he'd written for her. A final judgment from the man who'd spent 32 years watching her transform love into control, family into battlefield. That evening I made a decision. I found Diane in the kitchen, preparing her usual solitary dinner of grilled chicken and steamed vegetables. She looked up when I entered, her expression guarded. "I'm leaving," I told her. Something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe, or possibly regret. "Where will you go?" "I'm buying a condo downtown, near the park." I'd made the offer that afternoon, using the equity from my share of the house as collateral. "I'll be out by the weekend." She nodded slowly. "And the arrangement?" "The legal situation. I'll sign whatever James draws up. You can buy me out over time, reasonable payments. I'm not interested in forcing a sale anymore. Why? The question seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised me. I thought about Richard's photo, about the years of small kindnesses he'd shown me, about the way he'd protected me even in death. Because Richard wouldn't have wanted me to destroy his family, even to save myself. He would have wanted me to be better than that. I placed the envelope containing the photograph on the counter between us. This is for you. From him. Diane stared at the envelope like it might bite her. When she finally opened it and saw the photo, her face went through the same transformation I'd witnessed weeks earlier. But this time, there was something else mixed in with the shock. Something that looked almost like shame. She read the words on the back, and I watched 27 years of carefully constructed self-image crumble in an instant. Not the family matriarch she'd styled herself as, but a woman who'd confused control with love for so long she'd forgotten the difference. He really did see everything, didn't he? She whispered. Yes. I think he did. She looked up at me then, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw the woman she might have been without all the armor. Smaller, more frightened, but also more human. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry for all of it. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that we could start over, that forgiveness was possible. But some things couldn't be undone with apologies, no matter how sincere they seemed. I know, I said instead. But some bridges can't be rebuilt, Diane. Some trust can't be repaired. I left her sitting in that kitchen, holding the photograph that contained her late husband's final verdict on their marriage. It felt like the most honest conversation we'd ever had. 3 days later, I packed my belongings. Really packed them this time, not the hasty evacuation she'd once demanded. Adam helped me load boxes into a rented truck, both of us crying a little as we worked. I keep thinking if I'd just stood up to her earlier. He said as we carried my grandmother's china to the truck. We all have things we wish we'd done differently. But as I drove away from the house that had never quite felt like home, I realized I didn't have as many regrets as I'd expected. Richard had taught me something valuable in those final months. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait for the right moment, that patience could be its own form of power. The condo I'd bought was small but bright, with windows that faced east toward the sunrise. I hung Richard's garden photo, the one of us with the roses, in the living room where I could see it every morning. Kept his name too. Matthews suited me better than I'd ever imagined. And somewhere, in whatever place fathers go when their work on earth is done, I believed Richard Matthews was finally at peace, knowing he'd kept his promise to watch over me after all. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came an unexpected phone call. Lindsay? It's Adam. I paused in my morning routine. Coffee brewing, NPR murmuring from the kitchen radio, sunlight streaming through windows that were finally, truly mine. We'd spoken exactly twice since the divorce papers were signed, both conversations awkward and brief. How are you? I asked, settling into the chair by my east-facing window. Good. Better, actually. I wanted you to know, Mom's selling the house. That surprised me. Really? She says it's too big for one person. Too many ghosts. He was quiet for a moment. She found a nice apartment in that senior community near the lake. Downsizing, she calls it. Downsizing. More like right-sizing finally. She asked me to give you something before the house sells. Dad's garden tools. She thought you'd want them. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Richard's tools. The ones he'd used to tend those roses, to teach me that beautiful things required patience and care. I'd like that very much. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory for two people learning to be friends after failing to be married. Adam looked better than I'd seen him in years. Lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying weight he hadn't realized. I've been seeing someone, he said as we sat with our drinks. A therapist. Trying to understand how I let things get so bad. That's good, Adam. Really. She says I have to stop trying to fix everyone else's problems and start fixing my own. He smiled ruefully. Apparently I have commitment issues with my own happiness. It was the most self-aware thing I'd ever heard him say. For what it's worth, I said, you're a good man who got caught between two strong women. That's not entirely your fault. Maybe. But choosing sides instead of choosing truth, that was my fault. We talked for an hour, easy conversation between two people who'd finally stopped trying to force something that wasn't meant to be. When we hugged goodbye in the parking lot, it felt like forgiveness. Not just his for me or mine for him, but both of us forgiving the people we'd been when we didn't know better. That evening, I planted Richard's rose bushes in the small garden behind my condo. The previous owner had left raised beds that were perfect for them, almost like he'd known they were coming. As I worked the soil with Richard's well-worn spade, I thought about the woman I'd been 18 months ago, so eager to belong somewhere that I'd forgotten I already belonged to myself. I thought about Diane, learning to live in a space sized for one person instead of an empire. I thought about Adam, finally brave enough to look at his own reflection instead of just his mother's approval. Mostly, though, I thought about Richard and the quiet revolution he'd orchestrated from beyond the grave. Not with anger or vengeance, but with the patient certainty that truth, given enough time, always finds its way to the surface. The roses would bloom again this summer. Different soil, different light, but the same essential beauty. Some things once planted with love never really die. They just find new places to grow. If this story of quiet justice had you on the edge of your seat, press that like button right now. My favorite part was when Lindsay calmly handed Diane that black folder and watched her entire world crumble in real time. What was your favorite moment? Was it Richard's secret garden conversation? The moment Diane tried to evict Lindsay? Or maybe when that attorney confirmed Lindsay owned 44% of everything? Drop your favorite scene in the comments below. Don't miss more incredible stories of karma and justice like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload when someone gets exactly what they deserve.
I'm Amber Mitchell, 24 years old, sitting alone at the most expensive restaurant in the city, staring at a $12,000 bill I can't pay. My hands shake as I read my parents' note. Let's see how failure finds his way out of this one. Consider it life training. They planned this joke to teach me about responsibility, something they claim I lack. But this time, they've gone too far. The leather check holder feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds as I struggle to breathe. If you're watching this, let me know where you're viewing from and hit that like and subscribe button to follow my journey from this humiliating moment to the unexpected path it led me down. Growing up in the Mitchell household meant living under a microscope. My parents, Lauren and Jason Mitchell, built their real estate empire from scratch, turning a small investment into a multi-million-dollar business within a decade. Their success story was impressive, but it cast a long shadow over my childhood. Every achievement wasn't celebrated, it was expected. Every failure was magnified and cataloged for future reference. Our 5-bedroom house in Highland Park showcased their success with its marble countertops and sweeping staircase, but the perfectionism that permeated every corner made it feel more like a museum than a home. Photographs of family vacations displayed on the walls captured smiling faces, but the cameras missed the tension before each shot, my mother adjusting my posture or my father reminding me to smile like you mean it. Excellence isn't a goal, Amber. It's the baseline, my father would say while reviewing my report card. An A- in calculus wasn't cause for celebration, but for concerned conversations about slipping standards. My mother would sit beside him, nodding in agreement, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the kitchen table. The lessons started early. When I was 7, I forgot my lines during a school play. Instead of comfort, I received a week of mandatory rehearsals in our living room. At 12, I came in second place at a regional spelling bee. My prize was 3 additional hours of vocabulary practice each day for a month. We're preparing you for the real world, my mother would explain. No one out there rewards mediocrity. The defining moment came during my senior year of high school. Despite maintaining a 4.0 GPA, participating in numerous extracurriculars, and securing admission to several prestigious universities, I committed the ultimate sin in the Mitchell household. I chose to attend Rhode Island School of Design instead of my parents' alma mater, Princeton University. Art? My father had scoffed, sliding my acceptance letter across the table like it was contaminated. That's not a career path, Amber. That's a hobby. My mother's disappointment manifested in a more subtle, but equally painful way. I just don't understand why you'd throw away your potential like this, she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of resignation that had become the soundtrack to our relationship. Despite their disapproval, I followed my passion. For years of art school gave me a taste of freedom, but financial realities meant I couldn't completely sever ties. My parents paid my tuition, a fact they never let me forget, though they made it clear this investment was reluctant at best. After graduation, I secured a position at a small but respected gallery in Chicago. For 18 months, I maintained my independence, even if my studio apartment could fit inside my parents' walk-in closet. I was making it on my own terms. Until I wasn't. Budget cuts hit the gallery hard. As the newest hire, I was the first to go. With rent due and savings depleted, I faced the humiliating prospect of moving back home at 24. My parents' response to my predicament was a mixture of smug satisfaction and conditional support. "Of course you can stay with us," my mother said over the phone. "This is what happens in the art world. At least now you understand." The move back home re-established old patterns with frightening speed. My bedroom remained unchanged, a time capsule of high school achievements, but new rules were implemented. Curfews, check-ins, career strategy sessions that invariably involved suggestions for business school applications. The word failure became more frequent in my parents' vocabulary. It wasn't always direct. Sometimes it was wrapped in concern or disguised as advice, but it was ever present. Each job rejection letter or unanswered email became evidence in their ongoing case against my chosen path. 3 months into this arrangement, my father announced we would be having dinner at Lucille, the most exclusive restaurant in the city where reservations were typically booked months in advance. "We'll be dining with the Thompsons," he explained, referencing longtime business associates. "Wear something appropriate." The drive to the restaurant was uncomfortably silent except for my mother's occasional comments about my appearance. "Couldn't you have done something more with your hair?" she asked, eyeing my simple updo in the rearview mirror. "First impressions matter." I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur together, unaware that this dinner would become a turning point in my life, just not in the way my parents had planned. Lucille occupied the entire top floor of a downtown skyscraper, its glass walls offering panoramic views of the city skyline. A uniformed doorman greeted us as we entered the marble lobby, and a private elevator whisked us to the restaurant. The maitre d' recognized my father immediately. "Mr. Mitchell, how wonderful to see you again. Your table is ready." We followed him through the dimly lit restaurant, passing tables of well-dressed patrons engaged in hushed conversations. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the space, and live piano music provided a sophisticated soundtrack. I felt underdressed despite wearing my best black dress and the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me for graduation. Scott and Heather Thompson were already seated at our table. Scott rose to his feet, greeting my father with a firm handshake and my mother with a kiss on the cheek. Heather offered a practiced smile. "And this must be your daughter," Scott said, turning toward me with evaluating eyes. "Yes, Amber is staying with us temporarily," my father explained, emphasizing the word temporarily just enough to make me wince. "She's between opportunities at the moment." The way he phrased it made my job loss sound like a gap year rather than the professional setback it was. I forced a smile and extended my hand. "It's nice to meet you both," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Amber was working at an art gallery, my mother added as we took our seats. "Unfortunately, the arts sector can be so volatile." Heather nodded sympathetically. "My niece went through a similar phase. She's in law school now." The conversation moved on before I could defend my career choice, shifting to business matters and mutual acquaintances. I remained silent, studying the menu with growing alarm. The prices were astronomical. Appetizers starting at $80, main courses well into the hundreds. A sommelier appeared at our table, presenting my father with a leather-bound wine list. After a brief consultation, he selected a bottle of Chateau Margaux that cost more than my monthly rent had been in Chicago. "We're celebrating tonight," my father announced as the wine was poured. "Scott and I just closed the Westridge deal." Glasses were raised in a toast, and I joined in despite having no idea what the Westridge deal entailed. My parents had never included me in their business discussions, viewing my lack of interest in real estate as another personal failing. When it came time to order, my father waved his hand dismissively at the menu. Get whatever you want, Amber. It's a special occasion. The others ordered with the confidence of people who dined at such establishments regularly. Foie gras, Kobe beef, truffle-infused everything. I selected the least expensive options I could find, which were still ridiculously priced. Throughout the appetizer course, I attempted to join the conversation several times, only to be subtly cut off or redirected. When I mentioned a prominent artist whose work the gallery had featured, my mother quickly changed the subject to the Thompsons' recent vacation in Bali. By the time the main course arrived, I'd given up trying to participate. I focused on my food instead, a perfectly cooked but modestly portioned sea bass that somehow justified its $200 price tag. Halfway through the meal, my father's phone rang. He checked the screen and frowned. "It's Jenkins," he said to Scott. "We should take this." "And I need to powder my nose," my mother added, standing up. "Heather, would you like to join me?" Within moments, I was alone at the table. I checked my watch after finishing my sea bass. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. At the 30-minute mark, I began to worry. I sent a text to my mother. "Everything okay?" No response. At 45 minutes, the server approached with dessert menus. "Will the rest of your party be returning soon?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "They took a call." He nodded and retreated, only to return minutes later with a leather folder. "In the meantime, the gentleman asked that I bring this to you." My stomach dropped as I accepted the folder. Inside was the bill, a single sheet of paper with a number that made me gasp. $12,459.87. Beneath it was a handwritten note in my father's unmistakable handwriting. "Let's see how failure finds his way out of this one. Consider it life training." The room began to spin as I stared at the 5-figure sum on the bill. My lungs felt like they were collapsing, each breath becoming more shallow than the last. This couldn't be happening. Even for my parents, this level of cruelty seemed unimaginable. My trembling fingers reached for my phone, pulling up my father's contact. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried my mother next, same result. With growing panic, I sent text messages to both. "This isn't funny. Please come back." The messages showed as delivered but remained unread. After several more attempts, I discovered both numbers had blocked me. This wasn't a momentary lesson. They had planned this humiliation meticulously. The server returned, hovering expectantly near the table. "Is everything all right, miss?" "My parents. They'll be back any minute," I lied, voice cracking. "They're just taking an important call." He nodded but remained unconvinced. "Of course. Take your time." As he walked away, I noticed other diners glancing in my direction. Had word spread about my predicament? Or was my distress that visible? Either way, the weight of their stares intensified my humiliation. With shaking hands, I opened my banking app. My balance stared back at me, $267.43. Not even close to covering the appetizers, let alone the entire bill with its rare wines and expensive entrees. This wasn't the first lesson my parents had orchestrated. When I was 16, they had dropped me off at the mall without warning, taking my phone and wallet, telling me to figure out how to get home to teach me resource management. I'd ended up calling my grandmother from a store phone. During college, they had once forgotten to send my housing payment to teach me financial responsibility, forcing me to crash on a friend's couch until I could convince them to reinstate it. But this was different. This was public humiliation designed to break me completely. The restaurant manager approached my table, his expression professionally neutral, but eyes assessing. His name tag read Connor. "Ms. Mitchell, is everything all right with your dining experience tonight?" he asked, his tone revealing he already suspected something was wrong. I swallowed hard. There seems to be a misunderstanding. My parents, they stepped away, but they're handling the bill. Connor's expression didn't change. "Your father called the restaurant. He informed us that you would be settling the account." My heart sank further. "There must be a mistake," I whispered, though I knew there wasn't. This was exactly what my parents had planned. "I'm afraid not." "He was quite clear," Connor replied. His voice lowered slightly. Is there an issue with the payment? The tears I'd been fighting spilled over. I can't pay this, I admitted, the words burning my throat. I don't have this kind of money. His professional demeanor hardened. I see. In that case, I'll need to ask you to call someone who can help you resolve this situation. Otherwise, we may need to involve the authorities. The threat of police involvement sent a fresh wave of panic through me. A scene from a television show flashed through my mind, a woman being led out of a restaurant in handcuffs for dining and dashing. Would they actually arrest me? Could my parents really want this to happen? Please, I begged, let me try to figure something out. Can I make partial payment now and the rest later? Connor's expression remained impassive. I'm afraid we don't offer payment plans, Miss Mitchell. As we spoke, more diners turned to watch our interaction, their expressions ranging from curiosity to judgment. My public humiliation was now complete. With nowhere else to turn, I called my best friend Riley. I need help, I said when she answered, my voice barely audible. I'm at Lucille, and my parents left me with a huge bill as some kind of sick lesson. How huge? Riley asked. When I told her the amount, she gasped. Amber, I don't have that kind of money. I could maybe transfer you $200, but that's literally all I have until payday. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Anything helps, I said. After hanging up, Connor suggested I call other family members. With limited options, I tried my Aunt Jennifer, my mother's sister who had always been kinder than the rest of the family. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry, she said after I explained the situation. That sounds exactly like something your mother would do. I would help, but I'm in Europe right now. By the time I could transfer money, it would be too late. With each failed attempt, the reality of my situation became clearer. I was trapped, exactly as my parents had intended. Is there anything else you could offer as collateral? Connor asked, his voice lowering again. Jewelry? A watch. I shook my head, then paused. I did have one thing of potential value, my portfolio. I'd brought it to dinner hoping to show my parents my recent work, a pathetic attempt to earn their approval yet again. I have my artwork, I said hesitantly. Original pieces. They're worth something. Connor raised an eyebrow but gestured for me to show him. I retrieved the leather portfolio from beside my chair and carefully opened it on the cleared table. Inside were my best pieces, detailed urban landscapes with hidden elements that revealed themselves only upon close inspection. To my surprise, Connor's professional facade cracked slightly as he examined the first piece. These are quite good, he said, studying the intricate details of a cityscape at dusk. You did these. I nodded, a tiny flicker of pride momentarily displacing my panic. I specialized in urban architectural art at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, he asked, looking up with new interest. That's where my brother studied. For the first time that evening, someone was actually seeing my work, really seeing it, rather than dismissing it as a hobby or phase. Connor carefully examined each piece, asking questions about my technique and inspiration that revealed he knew more about art than I would have expected from a restaurant manager. Did you ever exhibit at the Kingston Gallery? He asked. Some of your work reminds me of a show I saw there last year. The conversation about my art provided a brief respite from my crisis, a small validation I hadn't realized how desperately I needed. For a moment, I wasn't a failure sitting alone with an unpayable bill. I was an artist discussing my work with someone who actually appreciated it. As Connor continued examining my portfolio, I felt a strange shift in the dynamic between us. What had started as a confrontation was evolving into something resembling professional interest. Have you considered selling these? He asked, carefully returning a detailed piece to my portfolio. I've sold a few smaller works, I admitted, but nothing significant yet. The gallery I worked for was going to feature some of my pieces before they had to let me go. Connor nodded thoughtfully. My brother Tyler owns a small gallery downtown. He focuses on emerging artists. He hesitated, then added, would you mind if I called him? He might be interested in your work. Hope flickered faintly. That would be amazing, but would he come tonight? I'm still facing this immediate problem. I gestured to the bill that still sat ominously on the table. Let me call him, Connor said, stepping away to make the call in private. While waiting, I tried Riley again, who confirmed she had transferred the $200 she promised. It was a drop in the bucket compared to what I owed, but it was something. I thanked her profusely. "What did your parents think would happen?" she asked, anger evident in her voice. "Did they expect you to magically produce $12,000? "I think they expected me to call them begging for help," I replied, the realization dawning on me. "To admit I'm a failure and that I need them. This is about control." Riley's response was immediate and fierce. "Screw that. Don't give them what they want." Her words strengthened my resolve. I would find another way out of this situation any other way before calling my parents. Connor returned 15 minutes later. "Tyler's on his way," he said. "He's intrigued by my description of your work. But I should be upfront. Even if he's interested, he probably won't be able to cover the entire bill immediately." "I understand," I said, grateful for even this sliver of hope. While we waited for Tyler, I noticed an elderly couple at a nearby table watching our interaction with undisguised interest. The woman whispered something to her husband, who nodded before standing up and approaching our table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm Frank Wilson, and that's my wife Doris. We couldn't help overhearing some of your predicament." Embarrassment flooded me anew. "I'm so sorry to disturb your dinner," I began, but he waved away my apology. "Young lady, we've been coming to this restaurant for 30 years, and I've never seen such a disgraceful situation," he said. For a moment, I thought his criticism was directed at me, until he continued, "What kind of parents would do such a thing to their child?" The unexpected alliance brought fresh tears to my eyes. Frank turned to Connor. "I'd like to speak with the owner about how this establishment is handling the situation." Connor straightened. "Mr. Wilson, I assure you we're trying to find a resolution that works for everyone." "Are you?" Frank challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're threatening a young woman with police action because of something entirely beyond her control." As the men talked, Doris came over and sat in the chair beside me. "My parents were difficult too," she said quietly, patting my hand. "Not quite this dramatic, but they never believed I could succeed on my own terms." "How did you handle it?" I asked. "I left," she said simply. "Built my own life. It was the hardest and best decision I ever made." She nodded toward Frank. "Met him 2 years later. He saw value in me that my family never did." Their unexpected kindness was overwhelming. These strangers were showing more compassion than my own parents had in years. 20 minutes later, Tyler arrived. He was younger than Connor, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, with the same observant eyes as his brother. He greeted me with a warm handshake before turning his attention to my portfolio. Unlike Connor's polite interest, Tyler's evaluation was intensely focused. He studied each piece in silence, occasionally asking technical questions about my process or inspiration. The minutes stretched uncomfortably as he reviewed my work, but I resisted the urge to fill the silence with nervous chatter. Finally, he looked up. "These are excellent," he said. "Particularly this series." He pointed to my urban nightscapes, a collection I'd created during my final year at RISD. There's something reminiscent of Edward Hopper, but with a modern architectural perspective that feels fresh. His specific, thoughtful feedback was validation I hadn't realized I was starving for. It wasn't the vague, very nice comments I'd received from family friends or the dismissive, interesting hobby remarks from my parents. This was a professional acknowledging my work on its artistic merits. "I'd like to feature these in my gallery," Tyler said. "And I'm prepared to purchase 2 pieces outright tonight." My heart raced. "How much are you offering?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure he named wasn't enough to cover the entire bill, but combined with Riley's contribution and what little I had in my account, it would make a significant dent. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a new worry. "But these are some of my best pieces," I said. "I was hoping to build my portfolio with them." Tyler smiled. "That's exactly why I want them. They show your potential. And I'm not just buying the art, I'm investing in your future exhibitions at my gallery." As we negotiated terms, Connor approached with an update. "I've spoken with the management," he said. Given the unusual circumstances, they've agreed to reduce the bill by 15% as a professional courtesy. The combination of Tyler's purchase, the discount, and the contributions from Riley and my own account still left me about $2,000 short. I was calculating how long it would take me to repay that amount when Frank Wilson approached again. "The difference is taken care of," he said firmly. "I can't accept that," I protested. "It's too much. Consider it an investment, not charity," Doris said, joining her husband. "But we do have one condition." "What's that?" I asked cautiously. "You don't go back to those people tonight," Frank said, his expression serious. "No one who would put their child in this position deserves to have that child returned to them." "But I have nowhere else to go," I admitted. Doris smiled. "We have a guest house that's sitting empty. It's yours until you find your feet." Their offer was so unexpected, so generous, that I couldn't speak. These strangers had done more for me in one evening than my parents had in years. As Tyler helped me gather my remaining artwork and Connor processed the various payments, my phone rang. It was my father. After hours of silence, now he was calling. My hand hovered over the screen, tempted to ignore it as they had ignored me. But something inside me needed closure. I answered. "So, my father's voice came through, smug and expectant. "Did you learn your lesson?" Did I learn my lesson? I repeated, my voice steadier than I expected. "Yes, but probably not the one you intended." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What does that mean? How did you pay the bill?" "I sold my art," I replied, unable to keep a note of pride from my voice. "2 pieces, actually." His scoff was immediate and predictable. "Don't be ridiculous. Who would buy your little drawings for that kind of money?" The dismissal that would have crushed me hours earlier now strengthened my resolve. "Someone who actually understands art, unlike you. And I'm not coming home tonight." "Don't be dramatic, Amber," my mother's voice cut in. They had me on speakerphone. "You're overreacting to a simple lesson in responsibility." "A simple lesson?" I echoed in disbelief. "You left me with a $12,000 bill and blocked my calls. There's nothing simple about that." "Where exactly do you think you're going to go?" my father demanded, his tone shifting from smug to concerned as he realized his plan wasn't working out as expected. I looked at Frank and Doris, who were watching me with encouraging smiles, and at Tyler, who was carefully packing my remaining artwork into my portfolio. Even Connor, who had started as an adversary, now seemed firmly in my corner. "I have options," I said simply. "Goodbye." I ended the call before they could respond and turned off my phone completely. The simple act of disconnecting from them felt like removing a weight I'd carried for years. Tyler finished securing my portfolio and handed it to me. "I meant what I said about featuring your work," he said. "But I'd like to offer you something else as well." My gallery assistant left last month for graduate school. The position is part-time, but it includes studio space. The offer stunned me. "You're offering me a job? You barely know me." "I know your work," he countered. "And I know talent when I see it. The rest we can figure out as we go." As we finalized the details of both the art sale and the potential job, other diners who had witnessed the evening's events stopped by our table. A marketing executive handed me her card, mentioning her firm sometimes commissioned original artwork for their clients. A retired art teacher praised the technique in my Cityscape series and asked if I offered workshops. What had begun as one of the most humiliating experiences of my life was transforming into an unexpected networking event. The very public nature of my parents' lesson had created an audience for my art and my story. When all the payments were processed and the bill finally settled, I found myself standing outside the restaurant with Frank and Doris, Tyler, and, surprisingly, Connor, who had ended his shift. "You're welcome to stay with us as long as you need," Doris reiterated, giving me their address and a spare key. "The guest house has a separate entrance, so you'll have your privacy." "I can't thank you enough," I said, still overwhelmed by their kindness. "Sometimes family is who you find, not who you're born to," Frank said, squeezing his wife's hand. "We never had children of our own, but we've adopted quite a few strays over the years." Tyler offered to drive me to my parents' house to collect my belongings. "I'll wait in the car if you want," he said, "or I can come in for moral support." Just wait outside, I decided. This is something I need to do myself. The drive to Highland Park was quiet, giving me time to process the evening's events. My phone, which I'd turned back on, buzzed continuously with texts and calls from my parents, but I ignored them all. I would face them on my terms now. When we arrived, I asked Tyler to wait 30 minutes before coming to check on me. If I'm not up by then, call me. If I don't answer, then maybe worry. He nodded, understanding the seriousness beneath my attempt at humor. The house was ablaze with lights as I approached, suggesting my parents were anxiously awaiting my return. I used my key for what I knew would be the last time and stepped into the foyer. My mother appeared immediately, her carefully composed expression betrayed by the tension around her eyes. "Amber, thank goodness. We were worried sick." "Were you?" I asked, moving past her toward the stairs. That's an interesting way to show concern. My father emerged from his study. "Now listen here." I cut him off. "No, you listen. I'm here to get my things, and then I'm leaving." Their shock was evident as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom. They followed, protests and justifications flowing. The lesson was for my own good. I needed to learn self-reliance. They were just trying to help me grow up. I tuned out their voices as I packed, taking only what was truly mine: my clothes, my art supplies, a few cherished books, and the quilt my grandmother had made me. I left behind the expensive watch they'd given me for graduation, the designer clothes they'd insisted I needed, all the trappings of the life they'd chosen for me. When my bags were packed, I faced them one last time in the hallway. "You wanted to teach me a lesson about surviving on my own? Congratulations. Lesson learned." "Where will you go?" my mother asked, her voice smaller now, perhaps finally realizing the magnitude of what they'd done. "Somewhere I'm valued for who I am, not punished for who I'm not," I replied. My father's face hardened. "You're making a mistake. Without us, you have nothing." I thought of Tyler waiting outside with my portfolio and a job offer. Of Frank and Doris and their guest house. Of Riley and her unfailing friendship. Of Connor and his unexpected support. "You're wrong," I said simply. "Without you, I finally have myself." I walked out the door without looking back, tears streaming down my face. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally breaking free. Tyler was waiting exactly where I'd left him, engine running and radio playing softly. He didn't ask questions when I loaded my bags into his car, just gave me a reassuring nod as I buckled my seatbelt. "Ready?" he asked. I glanced back at the house where I'd grown up, at the front door still standing open with my parents silhouetted in the light. "More than ready," I confirmed. The guest house behind Frank and Doris's Victorian home was charming, a converted carriage house with exposed brick walls and large windows that would provide excellent natural light for painting. They showed me around with genuine excitement, pointing out the fully stocked kitchen and the small garden space outside my door. "We use it for visiting family mostly," Doris explained, "but no one's expected until Thanksgiving." "This is too generous," I protested again. "At least let me pay rent or help around your property." Frank waved away my concerns. "We'll discuss details later. Tonight, you need rest." After they left, I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, the events of the evening washing over me in waves. My phone continued buzzing with messages from my parents, alternating between demands that I return home immediately and softer pleas to at least let them know I was safe. I sent a single text: "I'm safe but need space," before silencing notifications from their numbers. I slept fitfully that first night, dreams filled with unpayable bills and disappearing parents. When morning came, I half expected to wake up in my childhood bedroom, the previous night's events nothing more than an elaborate nightmare. Instead, I opened my eyes to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the distant sound of birds in the garden. My new reality. Tyler had arranged for me to come to his gallery that afternoon to discuss the job and to deliver my purchased artwork. I spent the morning organizing my few belongings in the guest house and creating a budget based on the salary he'd mentioned. It would be tight, but combined with future art sales, it could work. For the first time in my adult life, I was making plans that didn't involve my parents' approval or financial support. The gallery was smaller than where I'd worked in Chicago, but beautifully curated, with a mix of established and emerging artists. The exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors provided a perfect backdrop for the contemporary pieces on display. Tyler greeted me warmly, introducing me to his assistant manager, Maya, before showing me to the small office that would be my workspace and the studio space in the back that came with the position. "It's not huge," he said, gesturing to the studio, "but it has good light and ventilation for painting." "It's perfect," I replied, already envisioning how I would set up my easel and supplies. The job itself was straightforward, helping with gallery administration, coordinating with artists, assisting during openings, and maintaining the website. The hours were flexible, allowing me time to create my own work. "When can you start?" Tyler asked. "Tomorrow?" I suggested, eager to dive into this new chapter. He laughed. "I like your enthusiasm. Tomorrow it is." That evening, I returned to the guest house to find Doris had left a casserole and a welcome note on the counter. The simple kindness brought tears to my eyes. I sent her a thank you text, which led to an invitation to join them for dinner the following night. Over a home-cooked meal that bore no resemblance to the expensive but emotionally fraught dinners of my childhood, I learned more about Frank and Doris. He was a retired English professor. She had been a pediatric nurse. They had met in their 30s, both having left difficult family situations in their 20s. "Family is complicated," Doris said as she served apple pie for dessert. "Sometimes the hardest part is accepting that you can't change people who don't want to change." I spent years trying to earn my parents' approval, I admitted. Nothing was ever enough. Frank nodded sympathetically. "Some people need control more than they need connection." It took me a long time to understand that my father's criticism wasn't about my failings, it was about his need to feel superior. Their insights helped me begin to process my own family dynamics from a new perspective. Perhaps my parents' lessons had less to do with helping me succeed and more to do with maintaining their control over my life. My first day at the gallery passed in a blur of new information and tasks. Tyler was a patient mentor, and Maya's friendly efficiency made the learning curve less intimidating. By the end of the week, I was settling into a routine that included morning work at the gallery, afternoon painting sessions in my new studio space, and occasional dinners with Frank and Doris. My parents continued their campaign of calls and texts, escalating to emails and even messages through Riley when I maintained my distance. They veered between anger, "After everything we've done for you," manipulation, "Your mother is beside herself with worry," and bargaining, "We can discuss more independence if you come home." I held firm, responding only with brief assurances of my safety and well-being. Each day of distance gave me more clarity about the toxicity of our relationship. 2 weeks after the incident, as I'd come to call it, I sold my first painting through Tyler's gallery. It wasn't a large sale, but it was to a genuine collector who appreciated my work on its own merits. The validation was worth far more than the dollar amount. "We should celebrate," Tyler suggested, closing the gallery after the sale. "Dinner? There's a great Thai place around the corner." What had begun as a professional relationship was evolving into friendship and possibly something more. Tyler was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in my work, and refreshingly direct. Our dinner conversation flowed naturally from art to movies to childhood memories, carefully skirting around my recent family drama. As weeks turned into months, I established a new life for myself. I found an affordable apartment close to the gallery, though I still visited Frank and Doris regularly for dinner. My work began attracting more attention, with several pieces selling to private collectors. Tyler featured my Urban Nights series in a group show of emerging artists, which led to a favorable mention in a local arts publication. The highlight came 6 months after that fateful dinner, when Tyler offered me a solo exhibition at his gallery. "Your new work is ready," he said, reviewing my latest pieces. "It's time to introduce Amber Mitchell to the art world properly." Planning the exhibition consumed my days and nights for weeks. I created new pieces to complement my existing work, developing a cohesive collection that told the story of urban isolation and unexpected connection. Themes that had come to define my own recent experiences. The opening night of my exhibition coincided almost exactly with the 6-month anniversary of my parents' lesson. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood in the gallery surrounded by my artwork and people who had come specifically to see it. Frank and Doris arrived early, bringing a small gift, a vintage paint box that had belonged to Doris's aunt. "For our favorite artist," Frank said with a wink. Riley drove in from out of town, enveloping me in a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "And I never doubted you for a second." Even Connor from the restaurant came, bringing his girlfriend and purchasing one of my smaller pieces. "I knew that night you were the real deal," he told me. The gallery filled with art lovers, critics, and collectors. I moved through the crowd, discussing my work and accepting congratulations, a glass of champagne in hand. Tyler stayed close, his quiet support a steadying presence as I navigated my first solo exhibition opening. During a brief lull in conversations, I noticed a new pair of attendees enter the gallery. My champagne nearly slipped from my fingers as I recognized my parents. They stood uncertainly in the entrance, my mother clutching her purse like a shield, my father scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. They looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than I remembered. Tyler noticed my sudden tension. "Everything okay?" "My parents are here," I said quietly. His expression hardened. "Want me to ask them to leave?" I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. "No, I can handle this." I approached them with measured steps, conscious of how different I was from the desperate, humiliated daughter they'd abandoned 6 months ago. My hair was cut in a stylish bob I'd never have dared try under their roof. My dress was vintage rather than designer. My posture was straight, unburdened by the weight of their expectations. "Amber," my mother said, her voice catching. "You look well." "I am well," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What are you doing here?" "We saw the announcement in the Tribune," my father explained. "Your exhibition. We wanted to see." The old me would have been pathetically grateful for their attention, eager to prove my worth through their validation. The new me recognized this for what it was. An attempt to reassert themselves in my life now that I was finding success. "The exhibition runs for 3 weeks," I said. "You're welcome to look around." I turned to walk away, but my mother caught my arm. "Amber, please. Can we talk? We've been so worried." "Now isn't the time," I said firmly, gently removing her hand. "This is my night." My father's expression darkened with familiar disapproval. "After everything we've done for you, you can't spare 5 minutes?" "Everything you've done for me," I repeated, keeping my voice low but intense. "Like abandoning me with a $12,000 bill? Like calling me a failure my entire life? Like treating my passion as a hobby and my independence as a personal insult?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We were trying to teach you responsibility." "No," I corrected him. "You were trying to break me so I'd come crawling back. But instead, you set me free." I gestured to the gallery around us. "This is who I am. Not your failure, not your project. Just me, succeeding on my own terms." A nearby collector caught my attention, waving me over to discuss a potential purchase. I gave my parents a polite nod. "Enjoy the exhibition. Or don't. Either way, this is happening without your approval." As I walked away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. They no longer had the power to define my worth. Whatever relationship we might rebuild in the future, if any, would be on equal terms, not as disappointed parents and failing child. The exhibition was a success beyond my expectations. I sold 15 pieces that night, including my centerpiece to a prominent local collector. Tyler couldn't stop grinning as he tallied the sales. "This is just the beginning," he promised. My parents left without purchasing anything or speaking to me again. I spotted them studying my work, my father's expression unreadable, my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Part of me hoped they finally really saw me, through my art. Another part recognized that their approval was no longer necessary for my happiness. As the last guests departed and Tyler locked the gallery doors, he turned to me with a smile. "How does it feel to be a successful artist, Amber Mitchell?" I returned his smile, thinking of the long journey from that restaurant table to this moment. "It feels like coming home," I replied. To myself. 6 months after my first solo exhibition, life had settled into a rhythm I could never have imagined on that fateful night at Lucille. My work continued to gain recognition in local art circles, with 3 more pieces selling to the same collector who had purchased my centerpiece. I had moved from part-time to full-time at Tyler's gallery, balancing administrative work with my own creative pursuits. The guest house behind Frank and Doris's home had given way to a small but charming apartment above a bookstore in the arts district. My space was filled with light and plants, canvases in various stages of completion leaning against the walls. For the first time in my life, I was truly independent, financially, emotionally, and creatively. My relationship with Tyler had evolved too, from professional to personal. We moved cautiously at first, both aware of the complications that could arise from mixing business with pleasure. But our shared passion for art and authentic connection made the transition feel natural. "I have something to show you," Tyler said one evening as we closed the gallery. A surprise. He led me to a previously empty wall in the main exhibition space where a new sign had been installed, "Coming soon, Urban Reflections, new works by Amber Mitchell." "Another solo show?" I asked, stunned by the prime placement and timing, just a year after my first exhibition. "You've earned it," he said simply. "Your new series is your strongest work yet." The validation of my art, not from parents or professors, but from someone who truly understood the art world, still felt surreal. Each small success helped rebuild the confidence that years of parental criticism had eroded. As preparations for the new exhibition began, an unexpected email arrived from Zach Forrester, a former classmate from RISD who had gone on to become a respected art critic for several online publications. He was in town reviewing exhibitions and had seen the announcement for my upcoming show. "Would love to catch up and preview your new work," he wrote. "Your last exhibition generated quite a buzz." Seeing him again after nearly 3 years was both strange and comforting. We had been close in college, not quite dating but more than casual friends, before life pulled us in different directions after graduation. He visited the gallery during off hours, and we spent the afternoon discussing my new urban series and his recent writing projects. "Your work has evolved dramatically," he observed, studying a large canvas depicting a rain-soaked cityscape at dusk. "There's a confidence in these pieces that's compelling." "A lot has changed," I admitted, giving him a condensed version of the past year's events. His expression darkened as I described my parents' lesson at the restaurant. "That's beyond teaching a lesson, Amber. That's emotional abuse." No one had used that term before, and hearing it spoken aloud was jarring. I had called their actions cruel, manipulative, and controlling, but abuse felt both too strong and eerily accurate. "I'm still processing everything," I said. "Some days I'm angry. Some days I just feel relieved to be free." Zach stayed in town longer than planned, attending gallery events and joining Tyler and me for dinners. His perspective as both an old friend and a professional critic provided valuable feedback on my new work. More importantly, reconnecting with someone who had known me before, someone who remembered my early artistic struggles and triumphs, helped bridge the gap between my past and present selves. What began as a professional reunion evolved into something more as Zach extended his stay. Tyler, ever perceptive, noticed the chemistry between us before I fully acknowledged it myself. "You and Zach have history," he observed one evening after Zach had left our dinner early to finish a review. "We were close in college," I admitted. "Nothing serious ever happened, but there was always something there." Tyler nodded thoughtfully. "I see the way he looks at your work. And at you." His smile was genuine if a little sad. Sometimes timing is everything. Our conversation that night led to a gentle, mutual decision to return to being friends and colleagues. Tyler remained my strongest professional advocate and a trusted friend, while my relationship with Zach deepened into something neither of us had been ready for during our college years. 2 weeks before my second exhibition opening, as Zach and I were discussing which pieces to highlight in the show, my phone rang with my parents' number. I had maintained minimal contact with them since the night of my first exhibition, occasional text messages and one brief, awkward lunch that had ended with my father questioning the sustainability of an art career. I should take this, I said to Zach, who nodded and stepped away to give me privacy. Hello, I answered, bracing myself. Amber. My mother's voice sounded strained. We just heard from the Prestons that you have another exhibition coming up. Of course, they hadn't learned about it directly from the gallery announcements I knew they received or the local arts publications. It had to come through their social network, framed as potential gossip or concern. Yes, it opens in 2 weeks, I confirmed. Your father and I would like to attend, she said formally, as if requesting an audience. If that's all right with you. A year ago, I would have desperately craved their presence, seeing it as validation of my choices. Now, I felt oddly detached from their approval. The opening is on the 15th at 7, I said. It's open to the public. There was a pause. We thought perhaps we could see it beforehand. Privately. And maybe have dinner afterward to catch up. The request, reasonable on its surface, triggered an immediate tension in my chest. Private viewings were for collectors and critics, not for parents who had spent years dismissing my art as a hobby. And dinner carried its own traumatic associations now. The gallery is quite busy with preparations, I said carefully. But you're welcome to come to the opening like other guests. My mother's disappointment was palpable even through the phone. I see. Another pause. We've been hoping to reconnect, Amber. To make amends. I'm not ready for that, I admitted, surprising myself with my honesty. Maybe someday, but not now. The conversation ended shortly after, leaving me with a familiar mixture of guilt and resolve. Zach, who had heard enough to understand the context, placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. Setting boundaries isn't the same as holding grudges, he said quietly. You're protecting your peace. The night of my second exhibition opening arrived with the nervous excitement I suspected would never fade, no matter how many shows I held. The gallery was transformed by strategic lighting that highlighted the play of shadow and reflection in my urban series. Soft jazz played in the background as early attendees began to arrive. Frank and Doris came first, as they had for my previous show, bringing a small wrapped package. Just a token, Frank said as I opened it to find a vintage fountain pen. For signing all those sales receipts you'll be getting tonight. Riley arrived next with her new boyfriend, followed by a steady stream of collectors, critics, and art enthusiasts. Zach stayed close, his presence both professional. He would be reviewing the show for ArtView and personal. An hour into the event, as I was discussing technique with a potential buyer, I spotted my parents entering the gallery. They were dressed formally, my mother in a designer dress I recognized from her special occasion collection, my father in his standard business suit. They looked polished and prosperous, and completely out of place among the eclectic, artsy crowd. Unlike their tentative entrance at my first show, they moved through the gallery with purpose, examining each piece methodically. I excused myself from my conversation and approached them, Zach following a few steps behind. You came, I said, stating the obvious. Of course, my mother replied, her smile tight. We wouldn't miss it. My father gestured to the nearest painting, a complex cityscape viewed through a rain-streaked window. These are quite impressive, Amber. Very technical. It was probably the closest thing to approval he had ever expressed about my art, yet it felt hollow, an assessment rather than appreciation. Thank you, I said, then introduced Zach. This is Zach Forrester. He's an art critic with ArtView and other publications. My father's demeanor shifted instantly, his business persona taking over as he shook Zach's hand. Forrester? Any relation to Senator Forrester from Connecticut? My uncle, Zach confirmed with a polite smile. The revelation that I was dating someone with connections to a political family visibly elevated my stock in my father's estimation. His subsequent questions focused on Zach's background and family rather than his work or our relationship. I excused myself to speak with other guests, leaving Zach to navigate my parents' suddenly enthusiastic interest. Throughout the evening, I noticed them working the room as if it were one of their business functions, introducing themselves as Amber's parents to key collectors and gallery owners. When they approached me again near the end of the night, my father's expression had the familiar calculation I recognized from childhood. He was reassessing my value now that my art showed commercial potential and my boyfriend had valuable connections. "We're very proud of what you've accomplished," he said, his tone suggesting he was claiming partial credit for my success. "We always knew you had potential." The comment that would once have filled me with pathetic gratitude now rang hollow. "Did you?" I asked quietly, because I remember being called a failure more than anything else. My mother flinched. "Amber, that's not fair. We pushed you because we believed in you." "No," I corrected her gently but firmly. "You pushed me because you wanted me to be a reflection of your success, not my own person." My father's expression hardened. "After everything we've provided, your education, your upbringing." "I'm grateful for the privileges I had," I interrupted, keeping my voice level. "But material support doesn't make up for emotional abandonment. Or for publicly humiliating your daughter to teach her a lesson." Other guests were beginning to notice our tense conversation. Tyler approached smoothly, exhibition catalog in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, have you seen the write-up of Amber's work? The critics have been extremely positive." His intervention gave me a moment to compose myself. When my parents turned back to me, I spoke before they could. "I'm building my own life now," I said. "If you want to be part of it, it has to be on new terms. Not as the directors of my life, but as people who respect my choices and my work." The gallery was emptying, the opening night winding down. Tyler announced the final call for questions and purchases. My parents stood awkwardly, caught between their desire to maintain appearances and their frustration at my newfound boundaries. "Perhaps we could have lunch next week," my mother suggested tentatively. "Just to talk." It was a small opening, neither an apology nor an acknowledgement of past wrongs, but it was something. "I'll check my schedule," I said, not committing but not refusing. They left shortly after, purchasing one small piece from the exhibition, more, I suspected, to save face than from genuine appreciation. Their validation, once so desperately important to me, now felt like an afterthought. As the last guests departed and Tyler's staff began cleaning up, I found myself standing before my centerpiece with Zach beside me. The large canvas depicted a solitary figure walking away from a brightly lit building toward a cityscape full of possibility and unknown adventures. "You know," Zach said thoughtfully, "when we were in school, your work was technically brilliant but cautious. Now there's a boldness, an emotional honesty that's transformed your technique." "Pain is a powerful teacher," I replied, studying the painting that had unconsciously captured my own journey. "So is freedom," he countered, taking my hand. The exhibition was a commercial and critical success, with most pieces selling within the first week. Zach's review highlighted the emotional authenticity and technical evolution of my work, positioning me as an emerging artist to watch. Tyler began discussions about a more permanent arrangement with the gallery, including dedicated studio space and regular exhibitions. A month after the opening, I signed the lease on my first true studio, a light-filled loft in an old factory building converted for artists. As I arranged my easels and supplies in the space that was entirely my own, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The cruel joke my parents had played, abandoning me with an unpayable bill to teach me a lesson about failure, had instead taught me the most valuable lessons of my life, that I was stronger than I knew, that genuine connection could be found in unexpected places, and that true success came from being authentically myself, not from meeting others' expectations. I opened the windows of my studio, letting in the spring breeze, and set a fresh canvas on my easel. Outside, the city sprawled in all its complex beauty. Inside, I was finally home. Have you ever had someone's cruel action accidentally lead to your greatest growth? Or found family in unexpected places when your biological one failed you? Share your stories in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of overcoming life's unexpected challenges. Thank you for joining me on this journey from abandonment to empowerment. Remember, sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the catalysts for our greatest transformations.